Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this webinar for the kickoff of the Department of Energy TRACER campaign. This webinar is being recorded and it will be shared as soon as it's been processed by Zoom and uploaded to ARM's YouTube channel. So to start, just to be sure that everybody knows what TRACER means, it is the Tracking Aerosol Convection Interactions Experiment. I'm Allison McComiskey, Chair of the Environmental and Climate Sciences Department at Brookhaven National Lab. While TRACER is being led out of Brookhaven by Principal Investigator Mike Jensen, the campaign is operated by DOE's Atmospheric Radiation Measurement User Facility, or ARM. ARM is a multi-laboratory national user facility with roots back in the early 1990s. Its mission is to provide strategic measurements for better understanding and model representation of clouds, aerosols, and their coupling with Earth's surface. ARM currently manages 6 large atmospheric observatories, 3 of which are in fixed locations and 3 of which are mobile. This extensive observational infrastructure is complemented by ARM's data archive, which manages nearly 30 years of data and is freely available. This TRACER deployment to Houston represents the first ARM field campaign in a large urban area. So to tell us more about the unique and exciting objectives of TRACER and the tremendous logistics involved in getting these deployments in place, we have impaneled 4 team members. The first is Mike Jensen at Brookhaven National Lab. Mike is a meteorologist and the TRACER principal investigator, and he works mostly with clouds, storms, and their interactions with aerosols. Jimmy Flynn from the University of Houston is a research associate professor and TRACER co-investigator. His specialties are in air quality studies and instrumentation deployment for this campaign in the Houston region. Heath Powers from Los Alamos National Lab is the project manager and ARM mobile facility site manager. So he works in deployment and operations of the ARM atmospheric observatories. And Chung Kwang from Brookhaven National Lab is an atmospheric scientist and TRACER co-investigator. His work focuses on aerosol formation, growth, and life cycle studies. So to start off, we're going to give each of them a few minutes to tell us a little about their roles in the campaign, and then we'll take questions after all 4 of the panel members have had a chance to speak. While they're speaking, hold your questions till the end, but while they're speaking, you can place them in the chat or raise your hand. And when they are done, we'll unmute you in order so that you can ask your question live, or we'll read it from the Q&A. Thank you, and with that, I will hand it to Mike.
Okay, thank you, Allison. As Allison mentioned, my name is Michael Jensen, and I'm the principal investigator for the TRACER campaign. The TRACER campaign is led by the Department of Energy's Atmospheric Radiation Measurement Facility, but has important interagency collaborators from the Department of Energy's Atmospheric System Research Program, the National Science Foundation, NASA, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and then researchers from, first of all, a number of local universities, most notably University of Houston, but also researchers from around the country and around the world. Now, the scientific motivation for the TRACER campaign, really the primary scientific motivation was to understand how aerosols impact storms. Several studies in the literature have suggested that aerosols, by changing the makeup of the cloud particles and precipitation particles, can make storms stronger and larger and rain more. But there's a lot of controversy about this process and a lot of debate in the literature. We're looking to take some new advanced measurements to be able to better understand these processes, with the goal of eventually improving the computer models that are used for determining weather forecasts air quality conditions, and future climate states. What we really hope to do with the TRACER campaign is resolve this debate, this ongoing debate in the scientific literature. Now, you might ask, why would we do this in Houston? So Houston is special in several ways. First of all, it's a subtropical humid environment, which means for those of you who are from the Houston area know that particularly in the summertime, we experience a great deal of isolated storm clouds. These storm clouds encounter a variety of natural and human-made aerosol sources. So aerosols are small particles of the atmosphere. Obviously, there's lots of different natural sources and also human-made sources from, for example, transportation and industry. So we want to understand the interactions among those, and indeed, do these aerosols make storms stronger? To do that, we're deploying a state-of-the-art atmospheric research instrumentation that I think others will tell you some more about. Those instruments are going to be deployed for a full year. So our campaign officially starts on October 1st and will go all the way through the end of next summer, with a great deal more extra instrumentation, particularly from our interagency partners, arriving next summer during an intensive observation period. And with that overview, I'd like to hand it off to Jimmy Flynn from University of Houston to talk about some of his components of the campaign.
Thanks, Mike. My name is Jimmy Flynn. I'm with the University of Houston, where I'm a research associate professor in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. I've been working in air quality in Texas for over 20 years now, and I'm very privileged to be a part of this project. This is going to be very exciting. Over the years, there have been quite a few air quality studies done in and around the Houston area. Many of these have primarily focused on chemistry, where we were studying the processes that were taking place and the reactions in the atmosphere with various gases and particles. And the meteorology component was primarily there to provide context for the chemistry that was taking place. What I think is going to be really unique about this program is we're really meteorology driven this time around, and we'll be using some of the air quality and chemistry and composition measurements to help us better understand some of those small particles and how they interact with the weather and these cloud systems that generate these thunderstorms and cause the rain. So this is going to be a very unique opportunity for us. So I kind of have two pieces on this project. One on the science side, where I'll be working with a group of researchers from Baylor and Rice University and UC Riverside next summer during the intensive campaign to do some of this type of research, where we hope to see how the aerosols, composition of the aerosols impacts the development of storms, as well as what the storms then do to the atmospheric makeup and composition when we get impacted by those storms. We get those cold outflows that we all are familiar with. In addition to that, though, being one of the local universities, we had the opportunity to help host the campaign and help build up some of the sites and on the infrastructure side. And so I'm going to hand it off now to Heath, and he can tell you a little bit more about that.
Sure, thanks, Jimmy. So my name is Heath Powers, and I'm with Los Alamos National Laboratory, and my role is to manage this atmospheric observatory that's, that's the instruments and the equipment that's at the core of this TRACER study. So as Allison mentioned before, all of this hardware is a part of the U.S. Department of Energy's ARM, or ARM. It's a National Scientific User Facility, which really is a resource that the DOE is providing to the scientific community to help further science. This atmospheric observatory is a collection of some sophisticated instruments to make those detailed observations about the atmosphere that the scientists are asking us for. For TRACER, we're bringing over 4 dozen instruments to get at some specific things that we're interested in, to make really detailed observations of meteorology, how much energy is in the atmosphere, the air chemistry, and to learn more about the clouds in the area. Clouds are always a big question of where they form, why they form, how much cloud cover is there, do they rain, do they not rain? So, so we are well poised with the instrumentation that we bring to get at the core of a lot of this stuff. We, have instruments that'll take a sample of the air from the atmosphere and study it for the air chemistry and the particles and the aerosols. We use Doppler radars to study the clouds and the associated precipitation with those. We have a lot of remote sensing instruments that are on the ground that help us understand what's happening in the atmosphere. A lot of these same instruments may be on a satellite looking down. We point them upwards into the atmosphere at our site. We also launch lots of weather balloons, something on the order of 1,500 weather balloons for this TRACER study, which gives us measurements from the ground all the way up to the top of the atmosphere. So all of this comes together to help meet the objectives that are part of TRACER and ultimately help improve our understanding of how thunderstorms work, how convection works, and do a better job in forecasting and modeling these things. And so with that, I'll hand it to one of our aerosol scientists who are part of the study, who are looking at those particles in detail in the atmosphere. Over to you, chung Kwong.
Hi, Heath. Thanks. Hi, I'm chung Kwong, an atmospheric scientist from Brookhaven National Laboratory. And as a TRACER co-investigator, and as Heath just mentioned, I'm particularly interested in studying the aerosol life cycle and its connections to weather and climate in the Houston region. So when I say aerosol life cycle, what I'm really talking about is how particles are formed in the atmosphere from various sources, as Mike had mentioned earlier, how those particles are then kind of transformed by processing within the atmosphere, and then eventually how those particles are then removed from the atmosphere. Right? In particular, I am focused on studying the formation, right, of these new aerosol or new particles from different kinds of emissions in the area, right, from both urban and natural sources. So measurements of the aerosol life cycle will provide, the critical foundation needed to improve model predictions of aerosol impacts on clouds and storms. And I can certainly provide more detail regarding how those aerosol measurements are being made. And so now I'd like to open the webinar to questions.
Great, thank you, Chung-Gai. So we have a really great question to start off with that I'm going to throw to you, Mike. And that is, does TRACER signal a new era of field campaigns related to urban environments? So that's kind of looking forward, but also looking back to what degree was it influenced by CARES Go Amazon and other ARM campaigns that took some urban influences into account?
Yeah, so thank you, Allison. That's a great question. In the introduction, Allison mentioned this is the first time ARM has deployed one of their mobile facilities directly in an urban environment. However, there have been campaigns previously that definitely had some urban influences. I do think ARM has deployed over its 30 years in every type of environment you can imagine, from the South Pole to the North Pole to the tropics, continental and oceanic sites. But we know that the urban environment is where most of the people live. And so understanding the processes going on in the urban environment and the impacts and effects on the people who live there are an important area of research, and one that I think is growing in the general atmospheric science community. Is this moving us into a new era of ARM measurements? I'm not sure if I quite say that, but it's definitely taking us some new directions and giving us new opportunities to look at the science that influences where people live.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Another question, and we'll pass this to you, Heath. What airborne assets, if any, will come into play during TRACER? In particular, will unmanned and aerial systems, tethered balloons be used?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. We are extremely interested in what's happening in the atmosphere, and we do a pretty good job of measuring that stuff from the ground, but airborne assets really get our instrumentation up into the places where we're interested in making measurements. So there's quite a few different aerial assets who've committed to TRACER already. The ARM program itself operates a tethered balloon. So this is like a big blimp that goes up, you know, a half a mile or so into the atmosphere, and it carries instruments up into the place where we're interested in doing measurements. Several aircraft have also committed at least interest to TRACER. The NSF is planning to bring a C-130 to do some overflights, and a few others as well who are also expressed interest. There likely will be some drone activity with this. I think even just on this call here with Jimmy Flynn from University of Houston is considering making some measurements as a part of it. So this is all on the table and planned activities that really help us you know, bring more impact to these atmospheric measurements.
Great, thank you, Heath. We've got a two-part question here, so I think we'll start this with Chungai and then maybe pass it to Mike. But first, why is it important to understand how particles affect thunderstorms? If we learn more aerosols equal stronger storms, would this help us understand climate change or to advocate for new policies? And then a follow-on to that is, will this help forecast heavy rains that can cause flash flooding in Houston? So Chungai.
Great, thanks, Allison. So, you know, it's important for us to understand, first of all, just what the particles are kind of doing in the atmosphere, right? So, you know, from my perspective and from my experience, these particles, or these aerosols that are suspended in the atmosphere, right, are the ways in which a lot of processes and activities leave their signature within the atmosphere, right? So aerosols have both kind of natural sources and also urban and or industrial sources. And these particles, even though you can't really see them, right, because they're very small, they can have pretty important impacts on how mass is distributed through the atmosphere, how energy is distributed through that atmosphere. And it's that kind of, and it's those roles of transporting mass and energy that could have important impacts, right, on the development of atmospheric processing systems, such as those associated with, you know, the weather that we experience, you know, development of clouds, and even potentially those downstream impacts related to storms and severe weather.
Yeah, Mike, do you want to provide any additional information on how it might help in forecasting heavy rains and flash flooding?
Yeah, I think if indeed some of the theories and hypotheses that are out there about aerosols making storms stronger and raining more, understanding the physics of how that's happening and going on in the atmosphere is going to help us both in short-term forecasting, so that we understand how you know, we could improve, for example, the amount of the forecast of the amount of precipitation that falls out of any given storm. But then if that's happening often enough and making larger storms that cover larger areas, this has even a larger impact on the climate. So it's going to impact us on several different scales. But we want to understand that underlying fundamental physics to be able to improve those predictions.
Good. All right, Jimmy, here's a question for you, since you are in place there in Houston. Where will these assets be? In one spot in the Houston area, or will they be placed at various parts of the city based on the weather? Are they stationary or will they be moved?
So for the main assets on this project, the primary site is at the LaPorte Airport down in LaPorte, Texas. That's where the bulk of the equipment and activities are going to be focused. However, there is another site down in the Pearland area where one of the radar systems is based, as well as a radar wind profiler. So that'll give us the wind fields above that location. And then during the intensive campaign next summer, so this is looking at June through September of 2022, there will be a third ancillary site that's going to be established down southwest of Houston, down in the Needville, Guy, Texas area for those that are down here and familiar with those areas. And as far as there are going to be several groups coming in, myself included, that will be doing mobile measurements during the intensive period next summer. In fact, I'm actually calling in from one of our mobile labs today. I'm part of a TRACER add-on project that is going on as we speak. And so with this mobile lab will be out working next summer again, as will several other mobile laboratories. And we will be going out dependent on the weather forecast to different parts of Houston. And we carry very complementary measurements. We're not as extensive, especially with respect to the radars and things like this that are in place at the stationary sites. But as far as the gas and aerosol composition type measurements, we're very complementary to what is in place, such at the LaPorte main site there and at the ancillary site. So we'll be able to move these equipment around and collect data, perhaps in a more targeted approach based on actual convective cells and things like this.
Thanks, Jimmy. All right, Mike, this is definitely one for you. Unlike a lot of large urban settings, Houston is subject to oceanic influences. How will sea breezes and other such factors be measured? And at the outside of TRACER, are such influences thought to be very important?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Houston is a very interesting place because we have circulations associated with the Gulf, some associated with the Galveston Bay, and also circulations associated with the urban-rural interface. And actually, some of those boundaries and circulations that we get are actually part of the drivers for the storms that we see in Houston. So they're part of the reason we're here in the first place. But they do make things interesting, and we need to be able to measure those. So one great thing about the Houston area is there's already quite a few existing monitoring networks, one operated by TCEQ, but some other ones also that are going to help us quantify where the sea breeze is. And also some of the measurements we're taking are really looking to measure the thermodynamics of the atmosphere and to get that character of where the sea breeze front might be advancing to on any given day. So we definitely are looking to try to understand that interaction with the sea breeze and the convection that we observe. I think, again, related to the question before about urban centers, many urban centers are near the coast. So understanding these influences of sea breezes and the specific coastal environment, I think, is a very important aspect of TRACER, and it's going to be, even though it wasn't the preliminary focus, it's going to be a great opportunity to learn some new science that's going to benefit a great number of people as far as making improved weather forecasts and storm forecasting for those coastal environments.
Okay. Heath, maybe you can answer this one for us. Will TRACER instrumentation be up and running during large active storms? If not, what are the campaign's meteorological cutoffs related to severe weather?
Yeah, there is some irony here in that we are really interested in thunderstorms, but we also have, finite survivability on our sophisticated instruments that we bring. But in general, yes, we are going to measure through thunderstorms at varying degrees of severity. I think that our plan is to try and capture as much good data as we can. The exception being if we get into a big hurricane or something that may cause imminent damage to the equipment or be dangerous to the folks on the ground who are working with this. We have 3 full-time people who, work with all of this equipment to keep it operational and optimized for conducting the measurements that we're out to get. And, their safety comes first, obviously, but, apart from having to, prepare for an imminent severe hurricane, we expect to be measuring for the whole year.
All right. So Jimmy, in Mike's last response, he mentioned TCEQ. So maybe as part of the answer to this question, you can qualify what TCEQ is for the audience. But the question is, could you give us a sense of what legacy Houston area measurement facilities will be in play during TRACER, either from the city, the county, or universities?
Sure, that is a good question. So the TCEQ is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and they're the state regulatory agency. They, along with their city and county partners, so we have some sites in the Houston area that are operated by the TCEQ, others that are operated by City of Houston and Harris County and some of the surrounding counties as well. So those monitoring networks measure a variety of things. They have your standard meteorological parameters, temperatures, pressures, wind speeds, and directions. Many of them also have a variety of gas and aerosol measurements, things like particulate matter and ozone and carbon monoxide, things like this. So all of that data is still up and running and will be available as it is to the public, to the researchers for use on this. There are other networks running in the area. One of them, the Houston Lightning Mapping Array that comes out of Texas A&M, and I believe Texas Tech is now working with them on that for this project. They are mapping lightning flashes in the sky around Houston and can give us lots of good information about what's going on in the thunderstorms electrically. There are other networks of measurements from federal agencies. We have quite a few from NASA that are here that are doing some of the satellite style measurements that were described before, where these are similar to what satellites do, looking down from above, except in this case we have them looking from the ground upwards. So these things can look at aerosols, but also at gases. And so we're involved with several of those networks here at the University of Houston. We also run a network of sites. We're involved, I think now at last count, about a dozen different places in and around the Houston area where we operate measurements. Sometimes these are co-located with TCEQ or other sites. Some of them are just University of Houston that we do open up to outside researchers, such as the Moody Tower here on campus. We have a nice observation location here on campus where you can go up to the roof of an 18-story dormitory and conduct research. And so this is a very unique place, asset that we have here. So yes, many of the existing networks and infrastructure in Houston are going to be leveraged for this project so that we can make the most out of the time that the ARM facility will be here in Houston.
Great, thanks. Chungai, I'm going to pass you a couple of questions in succession. First is a confirmation, just that the theory that you're hoping to prove or disprove is that more aerosols in the atmosphere cause more severe storms. And following on that, did you pick Houston because it has more aerosols than other rainy areas? And if it does have more aerosols, does it have more natural or urban industrial aerosols?
Both really good questions. So I am going to start backwards, right, with the last question you asked. So, Houston, no surprise, right? And, is an area that's characterized by like a really dense urban core, a lot of urban activity, a lot of industrial activity. So, past field measurements have shown, and we fully expect there to be a strong signal from aerosol that are generated from these types of activities, right? But what we also hope to do, right, and which is a really neat aspect of this deployment, is we not only want to be measuring the urban or industrial aerosol signal, right, and what those impacts would be on clouds, on cloud development, but also very much interested in the signal from aerosol from more natural, rural, or agricultural areas. So Jimmy spoke to this a little bit earlier, how, we not only are going to have a measurement site, that'll be sampling a very urban environment, but also a measurement site that's at some distance away from the urban core of Houston, where we hope to be sampling more, atmospheric environments that are more, natural or more representative of a lower urban signal. So that's part of our strategy, right? And part of our hope that the measurements that we make, right, from these different environments in Houston will be able to help us kind of tease out what are the impacts of these different aerosol sources, right, on the types of science questions that are kind of centered on our understanding of, clouds, cloud development, and hopefully, right, we'll be collecting enough data that we can also speak to some of the questions related to potential impacts on storms and severe weather.
So as long as you're talking, Chungai, I'm gonna ask you the next question as well about the vertical profiles of aerosol properties. For example, number, concentration, size distribution, and chemical composition. Will the vertical profiles be collected and analyzed in TRACER? And if so, what altitude range will the campaign focus on?
Another really good question. So I would say that vertical profiles of aerosol properties will be collected and are kind of being collected right now, right, as part of the TRACER deployment. And depending on the kinds of vertically resolved aerosol measurements that are made, will kind of point you to the different properties that we're trying to measure. So for my kind of focus studies, part of my goals are to be making measurements of aerosol size and number, concentration, and a little bit about aerosol composition via ARM's tethered balloon system, right? Which is a very nice, which is a very nice platform that Heath kind of spoke to earlier, where we kind of put our aerosol measurements in little enclosures that are very securely kind of secured, right, to this tethered balloon. And then this tethered balloon then makes either vertical profiles throughout the atmosphere or loiters, where they kind of sit at a specific height and then sample as a function of time. And the kind of heights that we would like to be getting to, right, with these tethered balloon systems are going to be as high as 1 kilometer and maybe a little bit higher than that, depending on the cloud base height and the weather. But there are also vertically resolved measurements of other aerosol properties, right, that are made from, some of our vertically pointing instruments, right? These kind of remote sensing instruments that gather information about aerosol properties within the column. And then as both Jimmy and Heath kind of mentioned earlier, right, we also fully anticipate making vertically resolved aerosol measurements via these unmanned aerial systems, drones, and I think, I think those measurements, as well as, right, some aerosol measurements that will be part of some planned aerial deployments too. So that's our hope, absolutely, because in order for us to understand the impacts, the connections of surface measurements to what we measure, right, further into the atmosphere, we need to have measurements throughout the atmosphere in order to make those types of connections.
All right, thank you. So I think Susan Frank, you had your hand raised. Would you like to be unmuted and ask a question? I'm not sure if you're able to unmute or if we can get somebody to do that for you. All right, well, we're working that out. Jimmy, Can you tell us how we'll be able to separate the effects of industrial aerosols from natural aerosol sources like sea spray and other natural sources?
Sure, and so that's where some of the aerosol composition type measurements come into play. So certainly when we get sea spray type measurements, we're talking more about salts and things like this. And in addition to composition, we also have we can do back trajectories, right? We can look and see where this air was coming from. And so when we see high levels of salts and it's coming in from the ocean, then we know that this is a marine influenced air mass. And likewise, we've seen over the years, and those of us in the Houston area for sure, we know about the Saharan dust that comes in during the summertime when we get those marine flows. So we can look at that composition, and there's several, in addition to everything that's being brought in for this project, there are existing networks that do speciation of particles and filters, either filters where they're collected and then analyzed in a laboratory, or other systems which are doing this in real time online using both the chemical composition and or the aerosol, the optical properties of those aerosols. We can kind of start to get an idea of what is, particularly with dust and smoke impacts that may come into the Houston area or originate locally. As far as industrial, many of the industrial processes emit gases, and then those gases through reactions in the atmosphere can then form particles. And we can also look at those through a variety of means, some of which are at the ARM facility, others are going to be brought in during the intensive period next summer, that we can look at the chemical speciation of those aerosols and look at things like oxidation states, where we can see how old perhaps the aerosols are as far as a chemical lifetime in the atmosphere. Are they newly formed, or have they been more heavily oxidized as they've been in the atmosphere longer? So those kinds of things can kind of help us determine whether or not the aerosols we're seeing are predominantly human caused, or if they're from natural sources like dust or sea salts.
All right, great. So Mike, for you, we have another point of clarification. So in the beginning, you said that there have been controversial studies on this topic. What did those studies say? That more aerosol in the atmosphere cause more severe storms?
Yes. So first of all, maybe controversial was the wrong word. There's debate among scientists in the literature. But those studies essentially say that that aerosols may make storms stronger and larger and precipitate more. And that depends not just on the number of aerosols, but the number, the sizes, and the composition of those aerosols. And it may even be that there's a sweet spot where a certain number of aerosols causes this invigoration of the storms. And if you have more, it reverses the trend later. So we don't know the answers to those questions. That's exactly why we need to get out there and take these detailed measurements of what's going on inside the clouds, and how cloud particles are changing to precipitation particles, and how those precipitation particles are freezing or melting. All those processes that go on in there and how they're impacted by aerosols is what we're trying to understand, and how they eventually impact the overall strength of those storms.
All right. Heath, here's a question for you. Were there or will there be special challenges to sighting ground instruments in a densely populated urban setting?
Yeah, I think anywhere you site instruments, be it urban or rural or remote setting, you have different types of challenges. And so an urban area presents different sorts of challenges. Finding, the sort of ideal big open expanses that we like to have, nice big views of both horizons and all, can be a little bit challenging. But we have early on set up collaborations with local entities in the Houston area who are really good at this stuff. University of Houston are experts at measuring and deploying equipment around the Houston area, as is the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality, TCEQ. And so there are partnerships with them. This has actually been quite a nice place to locate instruments and all. So, some of the most challenging things, I think, are the Doppler weather radars that we bring, because they emit energy and they're big pieces of equipment. But I guess in that case, we're putting a precipitation radar in the Pearland area on the Pearland Independent School District land. So yet another close collaboration has really helped us find an ideal place. So, some challenges, but very easily overcome with the right collaborations.
All right, Mike, another one for you. I understand that photogrammetry cameras might be in place during TRACER. If so, what is this technology? What does it add to capturing cloud depth, cloud fraction, or other factors?
Yeah, so photogrammetry is kind of a measurement technology that has been revived in recent years as people have used this to try to complement some of the other observations we take. So this is just using cameras that aren't too different from typical security cameras that you might see that are used in different places to take high resolution photos of clouds in a relatively high spatial and time resolution. And with that, we watch the clouds grow with time, and with some kind of advanced processing and some detailed mathematical algorithms, we can look at things like how fast those clouds are growing then, how deep they're getting, and how much of the sky they cover. So it winds up being a very complementary measurement to some of the measurements we're taking at our main site, which are mostly looking directly overhead and measuring some of those same quantities, but from a different viewpoint. Having those multiple views of the same cloud systems really gives us a more holistic picture of what those clouds look like then.
Okay. And Jimmy, what satellite-based instruments will be used during TRACER, and how are these coordinated with surface instruments? I think we might have some technical difficulties. Jimmy looks like he's frozen. Maybe Mike, you can take that one.
So if I understand the question correctly, it would be more like how are satellites going to be used in addition to our ground-based measurements to tell us things. So, oh, we did lose Jimmy. Satellites give a very complementary view to what we see from the surface. So from the surface, we're able to observe from the bottom of the clouds looking up. And sometimes we can see all the way through the clouds, sometimes we can't, but it's definitely a certain viewpoint we have from the surface. When you add on that similar measurements, which I would say are generally passive measurements, which means we're just measuring the radiation coming from the clouds from up on top, it gives us that second viewpoint to be able to see the clouds now from the top down, and combining those is giving us a real nice 3D picture from different perspectives of what the total cloud system looks like. So in the end, you really want to have both of those views of the clouds in particular to be able to understand their growth and the structure within them.
Great, thank you, Mike. So as we're entering our last quarter of the hour, I'd just like to ask if there are any last questions from the group. If you'd like to raise your hand, just want to make sure we don't miss anyone. And so we'll ask one final question. And Mike, we'll pass this one to you as well. The study seems to be focused on weather and particularly on storms. Can you talk about the connection between weather and climate and how the data might help us predict or prepare for longer term changes?
Right, thanks. So that's a good question. So weather is really the building block for climate, right? Climate is the average weather conditions we see in any one place. So in the end, weather and climate are both impacted by the same atmospheric physics, the same processes that are going on in the atmosphere. And our real focus is understanding those processes that drive the weather and therefore also the climate. So anything that we're learning here that tells us about how atmospheric processes impact cloud or storm life cycle, or how they impact the aerosol life cycle that Chung was talking about earlier, those processes will help us to improve the weather forecasting models. And then by proxy also will give us important information to help improve the models that are used to predict climate, and help us in that respect use those climate simulations to inform lots of different decisions on energy policy, for example.
Okay. Chungai, a question for you. If I'm not mistaken, modelers are not often in the field during active campaigns. Will TRACER be an exception? If so, what will modelers do day to day?
So let me just kind of preface this by saying that, there are all kinds of modelers, right? Just as then there are all kinds of observationalists and experimentalists. And, we fully expect, right, especially during the intensive observation period next year, that there will be a very, a very kind of strong presence, right, of modelers to help us understand, things ranging from forecasts, right, that are being made to kind of understand what we were kind of hoping to be seeing within the atmosphere. And then our hope is to really make an effort with this campaign where, as we are kind of collecting, for the example of aerosol measurements, as we're kind of collecting and making these aerosol measurements, that we very quickly and rapidly begin to kind of ingest that data into the relevant model so that we can begin to quickly see and begin to quickly test out, is what we're seeing, right, going to be helping to fill in the gaps, right, of understanding that we are trying to study in this campaign. And, even potentially, like, are there ways in which the rapid uptake of these observations can even give us strategies about how to further optimize and improve the sampling that we're trying to do during TRACER. So, so I guess my answer is, our hope and our goal is for the data as it's being collected to be looked at and to kind of examined and be analyzed as it's being collected. And so this will involve certainly modelers of all different kinds, as well as scientists who are focused on understanding, as an example for the aerosol, better understanding aerosol processes, right, that are important science drivers for TRACER. Mike?
Yeah, Allison, I could add a little bit to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say TRACER was especially informed, as we were putting together the plans for TRACER, was especially informed by the cloud modeling community. So, so we designed this campaign specifically to take some of the measurements and address some of the questions that the people doing convective modeling, looking at the storm modeling, really needed answers about. So we engaged modelers very early on, and then I will give a specific example. So during the intensive observation period next year, yes, the modelers will be watching, looking to use this data, but we do have some groups that are actually going to be running their models in real time. And that's going to help inform some of the weather forecasts we're doing to help guide operations on a given day. So based on those model simulations and some of the operational models and other information that we gather, we're going to make weather forecasts to help determine how many weather balloons we're going to launch on a day, or what where the mobile systems are going to go, where the aircraft are going to go, how the radars are going to scan. And then, so in that respect, we're going to be able to use then the observations we collect that were informed by those model forecasts to feed back in the model and hopefully help improve that in kind of a feedback loop on the research there. So, so I think it's really a special component of TRACER that it had such a strong modeling input at the beginning, but we'll have that in the operational phase also. And then of course, the post-campaign analysis, there'll be strong modeling components because pulling apart some of these questions regarding the different aerosol types or aerosols versus meteorology, these are things that to untangle those different influences, you really need to use computer models to be able to tease those things apart.
Perfect. So I'm going to end with one last big picture question, Mike, and you can take this as well. How will the findings be applicable to other parts of the US or the world?
Yeah, so that's pretty important, right? Although we think that this, well, I know that this will have important implications for those living in the Houston area. We're going to learn a lot about this specific region and the physics going on here. But the physics that we're looking at is just intrinsic to how the atmosphere works. That's really what we're trying to understand. And Houston just happens to have lots of the conditionings happening often that will allow us to study those in great detail. But these processes, aerosol influences on storms, aerosol formation, growth, and life cycle, air quality, and interactions with sea breeze interactions. These are things that happen in lots of different places around the globe. So we're really digging into the fundamental physics that's going on in the atmosphere to help us improve the models that are used for forecasting the weather and the climate and air quality and all these things at locations around the world. So, so this isn't just a Houston thing. This is a global atmospheric science we're doing.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, well, I'd like to end by thanking everyone. First, our 5 panelists. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules while TRACER is kicking off and telling us what you're doing and answering these great questions. Thank you, all of the attendees, for asking a lot of really good questions about TRACER. And George, if we could share the slide with Karen and Sarah's contact info. So if you have any remaining questions or would like to do some follow-up interviews with TRACER scientists, please feel free to reach out to Karen or Sarah at their contacts listed here, and they'd be happy to put you in touch. So with that, I'd like to close out the TRACER webinar. Thank you again all for attending.